Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Mark Chesler. I am the Content Creation Tools Partner Account Manager for Dolby. I manage our relationships with Vintage King, but as well as Avid and Focal and others. So I'm a business development guy. I will tell you right off the bat. I'm not an engineer, so I'll walk you through this at a 30,000 foot level, but try to answer your questions as best as possible. But we have a bunch of other great resources here to get some of your more technical questions answered. We'll start off here, though. So the idea behind Dolby Atmos is that we hear the world in 3 dimensions. We wanted to bring a more immersive experience to listening to music. So just a bit of history to start off with here, and I apologize because my notes are not up on here, so I'm gonna wing this. Is that in 2012, Dolby introduced Dolby Atmos in cinemas. The first film to do Dolby Atmos was Brave. And since then, we brought it into home theaters, for film, for television, for streaming, etc. But somewhere around, I think it was, I don't know if the exact year was 2017, maybe 2018. Dolby engineers thought, hey, this could be used for music. This could be a really interesting thing for music and other formats. And so we brought Greg Penny in to, play around with it. And using our cinema tools, he took Rocket Man and created this amazing experience that convinced us that this was really the way to go with music, and Greg as well. The point of Atmos is, again, to engage your audiences with the best experience possible, using a truly 360-degree immersive sound. The difference, though, is that instead of the standard channel configuration that you're used to, you can actually take, Atmos is basically a combination of stationary channels, right, that you can use as what we call the beds, and then objects that you can move around in 360-degree space. So you can have stationary objects, but then you can choose to place, you can have 10 stationary objects, stationary beds, but then you can choose to have 118 objects, up to 118 objects, wherever you want to put them in that 360 space. So the example that we use, and this is going to be more of a cinematic example, is, but you want to have a bird chirping somewhere. You want to have a sound in a particular position. You can determine the X, Y, and Z coordinates using a panner. And what Dolby Atmos does is take that and convert it to metadata that can then be transferred to other, to playback devices to translate, right? And so you will get an accurate representation no matter where it's played back. Now I add to that, let's say you want to have something of size rather than just moving around. You want to have something of a larger size. Maybe it is the sound of the room, capturing the sound of a room. Maybe it's you want to have a particular instrument take up more space. You can do that within Atmos as well by adjusting the size of the object, along with the position of the object as well, and the movement of the object. So there's a few basic components to a Dolby Atmos workflow. There's the software, right? So you need to have a Dolby Atmos enabled DAW or workstation, which obviously Pro Tools is one of those. There are other options as well that have native rendering, but Pro Tools is one of our, obviously our most powerful partners here. Then on top of that, you can purchase the Dolby Atmos Production Suite or the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite, which is our rendering tool for Dolby Atmos. And then an interface, but also you need something to monitor that on you, which can monitor on headphones, and you can monitor on speakers, and obviously Focal is a great partner in that respect, right? So the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite is the first place that we'll start here. The Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite is a content creation tool that, when used in conjunction with, say, Pro Tools, either on a Mac or a PC, can be used to create and deliver immersive Dolby Atmos mixes. It includes the following software, and this is important here. It includes the renderer application, which is a separate renderer application, so you can have a separate rendering workstation. And the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, and you get up to 3 licenses of that. Now that is $1,000, and you can purchase that at Vintage King. The next one is, and this is sort of the entry piece for most people, is the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. Now that is a lightweight solution. It's only on Mac. It runs on Mac laptops, and it's optimized for music, editorial, all but the most complex of mixed projects, right? For QCing a project, for mezzanine QC, for deliverable rendering, and also for student educational environments where they may not want to use the mastering suite software. And that can be purchased right now for $99 on the Avid Marketplace. And you can also get a free 3-month demo at dolbycustomer.com. Now, just a little bit more about the renderer that comes, the renderer software that comes in the mastering suite. The Dolby Atmos renderer is a Mac or Windows-based system that processes the rendering of the object, manages pans, and author your files, in addition to controlling your speaker configurations and your room calibration within the tool. It renders the 7.1.4 bed audio, object audio, and metadata to your defined monitoring configuration, as well as rendering to traditional channel-based surround and stereo formats for monitoring and deliverables. So you can do fold downs to different configurations. The Dolby Atmos renderer software also records the Dolby Atmos master file, which is our own format, and exports it to a B-Wave ADM, which is used for both Blu-ray and streaming services, which obviously most music is consumed via streaming services. That's the one that's going to be important to you. And then the Dolby Atmos hardware renderer. So the mastering software has to operate on a specific piece of hardware that is configured appropriately. Again, that's something that you would work with your partners at Vintage King on to get this going. But in order to handle sessions with large track counts seamlessly and deliver .atmos files, you need to have this dedicated piece of hardware to do it most effectively. By laying out high standards and specifications for the renderer hardware, we've ensured that these systems will provide you with the most streamlined workflow. So there are specific specifications that you will need to follow, and I strongly encourage you, if you're getting a separate renderer, don't do it yourself. Work through Vintage King, because they will be able to configure it properly for you. So there's some other pieces of the puzzle that are helpful in some cases, necessary in others. If you wanted to use a DAW that isn't Pro Tools, I don't know why you would, but but if you wanted to use something that doesn't have Dolby Atmos support built in, let's say you're working in Ableton or you're working in Reaper or something like that, we do have a free music panner that can be downloaded at dolbycustomer.com. It allows you to do a Dolby Atmos mix without panning, and send it to the renderer without having one of the DAWs that we've discussed. It has a step sequencer. This is a kind of a cool thing. It does have a step sequencer for synchronizing panner to session or project tempo, so you can move objects to the tempo and automate that piece of it. So some people will use the music panner along with whatever DAW they're using, even if it does support Dolby Atmos. And it's free. So that's a good price. It's free. It's available at dolbycustomer.com. The other one is the Dolby Atmos conversion tool that does master file conversion, frame rate conversion, file trimming, concatenating reels, XML scripting is also available in that. It's available for Mac, PC, and Linux, but it's command line only in Linux. And that's also, again, free at dolbycustomer.com. And then the Dolby Atmos binaural settings plugin, that one is somewhat recent. You will be doing a lot of work in binaural. I mean, you should be, checking your stuff on headphones as it is right now. And this allows you to adjust near, mid, far, and make adjustments for binaural. One other piece that's I did not add in here, but I will tell you about this. We do have a beta program going on right now for personalized head ratio transfer function, which allows you to personalize your binaural experience in the renderer, right? So that you get a more accurate experience. You can look that up on Google, Dolby Atmos PHRTF. You'll find the link to the beta site, and from there you can download an app for your for your iPhone or Android device and do a scan of your head, get a personalization there. Dolby Atmos Album Assembler. This is our latest and greatest addition to our software suite. This one is something that was asked for by Michael Romanowski and a bunch of other big mastering engineers, and we finally released it, so they were very happy. And basically, this allows you to do a bunch of things that the renderer you couldn't do in the renderer as it existed. You can import Dolby Atmos ADM B-Wave files and sequence them on the timeline. You can edit song durations and apply fade-ins and fade-outs. You can apply EQ and limiting processing technology built from the ground up for Dolby Atmos. You can compare Dolby Atmos songs to mastered stereo files, right? The master stereo files with the stereo reference track. You can measure loudness. You can export master Dolby Atmos ADM B-Wave files. There is a free trial available of this at dolbycustomer.com. It does cost $99. It does require that you have the Dolby Atmos production suite or Dolby Atmos. You have to have the Dolby Atmos renderer for this to work. So, but you can download a free trial of that. And then interface. So while Atmos mixes can be enjoyed on any system, you'll need a 714 configured system or higher for mixing in order to take advantage of the fully immersive quality of Dolby Atmos. So if you're looking to take your Atmos mixes to the next level, you want to integrate an Atmos-equipped mixing console into your setup, like a Pro Tools rig with an Avid S6 console and Matrix Studio. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Focal. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark. So, a lot to take in there, right? A lot of information, a lot of, obviously this thing's moving 10,000 miles an hour, and everybody's trying to catch up. And Dolby's doing a terrific job delivering us kind of the tools we need to make things happen in a quick fashion. But my part of this, my name is Josh. I work for Focal. I'm the director here in North America for the Pro Audio division. And we make speakers, right? We're a dumb speaker, all analog speaker company. Been doing it forever. We just make speakers, a bunch of French people putting together boxes, super R&D centric. But today I'm not really going to focus on our stuff. We'll let you listen, and you can be the judge of that for yourself. But I do want to talk about how monitoring plays a role inside of Dolby's sphere, and what their best practices are. Most importantly, what things you need to consider if you're going to try to set up a system for yourself, and kind of what goes into that in sort of a real world step one sort of scenario, right? So in order to get started, you need to have, obviously, all the software that Mark discussed. We need a DAW. We need a renderer of some sort, whether it's production suite or mastering suite. And then we also need an interface, right, that has enough D to A conversion to spit out however many channels you want. So if we're talking the base configuration 7.1.4, we need 12 channels of D to A, right? You also need a monitor control that can gang all of those channels together, right? So you're controlling all the volume at once. You're going to need something that's able to delay your output so we can time align your speakers. We'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. And then also some EQ processing per channel if you want to mitigate some of the acoustic anomalies that are in your room, and also tune to Dolby's curve, right? So, but on the base, kind of starting out, we need to delineate the difference between room dimension and speaker dimension, right? In Dolby's world, they have a tool called the DART, the Dolby Atmos Room Design Tool. This is the initial tool that you set up when you're trying to choose what speakers you want, how much output you want, because output is a big part of the requirement. You need a certain amount of output. I'll get into that a little bit more. But you want to have a speaker dimension that's large enough so you can locate everything audibly in the space, right? Because if the speaker dimension's too tight, you're going to have a hard time with localization of all of these potential objects flying around. Right, so the minimum speaker dimension, and we measure speaker dimension from the center channel of the front baffle. So imagine this is our center channel. We're measuring from this point to the imaginary line between our two rear surrounds front baffle, right? So when we're talking about speaker dimension, the minimum dimension is 11.5 by 10 by 8. So 11.5 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet tall, right? So when you're talking about a room, if you have a room that's just that dimension, we still haven't accounted for the depth of the speaker cabinet, any stands, mounting brackets, whatever you may have. That's all worth considering, but you really need to hit that number minimally to have a reliable experience that translates everywhere else in the world. Dolby does have an ideal speaker dimension that they recommend, which is 21 by 18 by 10. And you don't want your room to be too big, you don't want your room to be too small. You kind of want to hit that sweet spot if at all possible. So obviously every room's a little bit different. There's always going to be a workaround. I've never once gone into a scenario where we put up speakers or done anything where there wasn't a surprise of some sort, right? So you have to be flexible. But it's good to try to stick to these best practices as much as possible when you're setting up the system. And it makes a huge difference. There's two different kinds of layouts. There's what we call an orthogonal layout, and there's an equidistant layout. Maybe Mark can kick in here, but we see probably 80% of our layouts are equidistant versus orthogonal. So an equidistant model, we're talking about having all the speakers, if at all possible, be the same distance from the mix position to limit any time alignment issues, that kind of thing. You're also considering what, if we're talking about the 38% rule, if you're familiar, in terms of acoustics, trying to manage that where you're in the front 38% of the room is typically where you're seeing those equidistant setups. Versus an orthogonal setup, we're talking about a rear-loaded setup where you have more room behind your LCRs. This is more typical in post-production environment, but is still just as, it works just as fine. It just takes a different approach, different measurements. So for Atmos music, Dolby does have a minimum recommended system configuration of a 714. That's far and away the most common that we see, but they do have a reference of 914, 916 that adds some width channels and potentially some mid-height channels to the scenario. So we have a 7.2.4, we have two subs here, just because there's a fairly significant output requirement on the low frequency side of things, but you can add to that setup, and the more you add, the more that translation falls at ease, right? If you go to a 9.1.4, you're adding those side surrounds, that can really, really help with translation from a binaural perspective as well, right? So the more you have, the better resolution you have, but also the more it costs. So it's a pro and a con, right? Monitor selection. This isn't really talked about a ton. This is what we found works best, and what in my conversations with the folks at Dolby we find works best. But it's always good to try to align all the speakers in the system with, if at all possible, the same model, the same speaker manufacturer. We don't want to have an inverted dome tweeter and then a silk dome external dome tweeter and try to mix and match all of these speakers, right? The goal, when you're talking about image, right? Everybody's always talking about how imaging is super important, and it is. But now we're not just dealing with a single stereo image. We're dealing with, the image between our left and our rights, our height channels, your left surround to your left side surround. All of the image needs to be the same. So as you're moving these objects around, you're not getting shift in the tonality of these objects, right? Because the moment that shifts, we're all in trouble in terms of translation, right? You want to be able to make really accurate assumptions about your mix and about what you're doing. And if that lens through which you're seeing everything isn't correct, it's a problem. So maintaining driver type, manufacturer type, if at all possible, is really important. We find that, especially on the ear height channels, right? Your normal 7, the first letter, or first number, the 7 and the 7.1.4, especially there is really useful if you can keep that speaker the same model all the way around. Output capability and room size, right? It's a big thing. When you get into the DART, if you enter your desired speaker dimensions into the DART, there is an SPL output capability requirement. And it's going to vary depending on what kind of room. If you're in a commercial space, Dolby wants to see an 85 dB SPL output level at mix position per speaker. And if you're doing the math, it's a lot of output, right? Versus in a home studio scenario, they're looking for 79 versus something, maybe you have a private mix space in a commercial facility, you're somewhere in the middle, right? And if you go through their onboarding program, which if you just Google Dolby onboarding, they have a really nice forum that will help walk you through making all these decisions for yourself moving forward. But that's a really huge deal because Atmos has way more dynamic range than a typical stereophile, right? So you have to have a ton of headroom to really properly QC these things. And on the post side, it's especially important when you have big, imagine you have a car crash here or whatever the case is. The difference between the quietest level and the loudest level is massive. So we really have to have a ton of dynamic range to ensure translation of everything in the system. And then monitor placement and calibration, right? We talked about when we're setting up speakers, Dolby has a very specific way that they recommend you set everything up, right? And in the DART, once you enter your room dimensions, it's going to give you speaker dimension, very important thing to distinguish, right? They're going to give you an exact location of every single speaker and where it needs to be placed in your space. And this is really, really important. You can change that. You can work with Dolby and the onboarding team to help manage that, right? But every single speaker in this room was labored over with me and lasers and tape and stuff like that for a couple days worth of time just to make sure it's perfect. And the difference there in terms of translation is massive. When you take your time and you do it properly, that's important. So placement one is very specific. The angles of every single speaker are they fall within a certain value. So your left and your right channels are going to be 35 degrees to 45 degrees. Center channel is going to be 0. Left surround, right surround are 90 degrees to 110 degrees, right? All firing down 10 degrees. So it's all very, very specific. This is all laid out in the dart. It will give you specific angles based on your room, your speaker dimension, your space. But it's really important to get to that. Once you've done those and you've placed all of those things, we need to calibrate output, make sure all of our speakers are aligned in terms of level, right? We need to delay the output of the channels to make sure everything's perfectly time-lined. If you're not using an equidistant setup, a true equidistant setup, you're going to have to time align all your speakers so everything's hitting at the same time. And the difference between aligning a box, and this is why something like an MTRX Studio or an MTRX is really powerful. If you get into the Dolby production suite, you have a single whole millisecond of delay time, which seems, we're all saying like, oh, a millisecond's not a lot, right? But you get to, some other boxes do tenths of seconds versus the Avid boxes get to hundredths of seconds, hundredths of milliseconds, right? And the difference between those is massive. When you're talking about hearing the difference between a tenth of a millisecond and a hundredth of a millisecond, you'd be surprised. It sounds crazy, but just being able to hear the exact location of that object moving around is really, really important. So we're calibrating that, getting everything time-aligned, and then once you hit that point, right, now you're tuning the room, right? And there's tuning to the curve, but there's also mitigating acoustic anomalies because the way that speaker performs in that corner is going to be a little different than that speaker performs in that corner. So once again, we want that translation from speaker to speaker to be identical. So we're just sort of using this process to mitigate any room anomalies you may run into, modal issues, things like that. If you ever tune to PA or any kind of monitoring system, you know how important this is, right? And then, that's kind of all basic things. And then there's the Dolby curve, right? So Dolby has a curve that they want the system to be tuned to. It's a very tight tolerance. I think it's plus or minus 1 dB.
I think that's right.
Correct?
That's correct.
Yep. So they have a curve they want you to tune to help translate through the Dolby codec, right? So really important to have that in place. And you'll get to hear all this stuff later today. We also do we have to mount things on the ceiling, which Ryan will get to here in a second. But getting a little bit into headphone monitoring, I'd say 80% of the people we talk to are consuming immersive content in headphones at the moment. So QC with headphones, as Mark mentioned earlier, is a really important measure to take. There's Atmos in headphones. There's spatial, which is kind of an adaptation of that. But it's really important to use this as a QC measure. And if you haven't dove into Atmos yet, this is the best place to start. You right now, with a trial of Pro Tools or a trial of the production suite or whatever it may be, you can have a set of headphones, sit down and start experimenting with workflows, how panning works, all the stuff today before you get deep into buying a system. And it's really important to make sure that you have a hard understanding of what's happening there, because so much is being consumed on this level, but it's still, I still can't express how necessary a monitoring system is. And as a guy who sells speakers, I'm obviously a little biased, but every major record that's being done at the moment is being done through a system, and there's just things that you can't get there, a certain accuracy, a certain precision. So it's a working relationship, and it's changing a little bit all the time, depending on the playback device, but really important to QC your stuff here, right? And now I'm going to hand this off to Ryan at Triad Orbit. Yep. Hand this off to Ryan. Ryan kind of saved our tail on the system. As you can see, we have some challenges with conduit and stuff, and every space has its own unique set of challenges. And the Triad Orbit mounts, we've used them on a number of installs, and Man, oh man, has it saved the day in terms of recallability and just flexibility. So I'm gonna let Ryan tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Josh. My name is Ryan Callis. I'm Director of Product Development for Triad Orbit. How many of you have heard of Triad Orbit prior to this? I know lots of engineers deep in the studio, and microphone techniques are where we come from. We were asked to tackle an issue that we didn't really even know was an issue. We were asked to, hey man, you guys just make the most solid stands and mounts, and everything's precise. Can you make speaker mounts? I'm of the thought we can make anything in the world, but so we dove in, and so I am going to talk about us because that's what we do. So as you can tell, via Dolby, via Focal, and via Avid, everything does have to be precise. There is a placement that has to be exact and repeatable and stable. So we took this on, and the first thing I did is I went and watched some installs, and I see two guys on a ladder holding a large speaker with a drill, and then, okay, now they got it there. Now they're using a wrench and aiming it, and the wrench gets it, and it tilts a little bit again. So all those things went into my thought process of, first off, that's manpower, that's labor, that's time, that's money. So how can we do this that it's easier, it's simple, and it's accurate? So started with a wall mount, and this is WM1. This wall mount can be placed strategically throughout the room via the Dart software. So you already know where everything needs, you already know the measurements. Now you go up and you place these prior to anything else. They can go on the walls and the ceilings. And then you take your swivel system, which is SW1, and the SW1 is a locking pin swivel. And each hole is 15 degrees in the tilt. So you find it and it's locked. And then you go ahead and lock it again. The pan is in 30-degree increments. And the same thing, basically you find your pan parameters and locked, not going anywhere. At that point, you'd already used, we have adapters for 80% of the speakers that would be used in an Atmos system. And so this was specifically made for Focal by us. Then you place the speaker on the swivel and you take that whole assembly and reach up and slide it into the wall mounts. Then there's 4 screws to hold that in. That's not going to move. Honestly, it's powerful. When I pass this around, this is a beast. And but what nice thing is, all of that work has been done on a desk. 90% of your parameters are set and right there. You slide it in, and you're really close to it. Then you make some final adjustments with the lasers and the SBL at the sitting position. So that's the beauty of, it's called SM1 system. It's super powerful, repeatable. So via the Dart that your down angles are going to be X amount. You can preset that on everything and then drop it in. Then we come to the piping on the ceiling. Again, that's even harder. Now, ever hold your arms up for 2 minutes and you're dying. So having the wall mounts just waiting up there, at that point, you attach these plates, PM1 plates, to the pipe. Now the pipe would be cut by your installer on location, measuring everything. This is not something you just go buy at Home Depot unless you got lucky. They're going to cut the pipe, die the threads, and cut the threads, and you're set. The swivel attaches to the pipe plate, and the second pipe plate slides right into the wall mount, ceiling mount. So literally you're just sliding it in and getting it lined, and you're set. Now, part of the beauty of it is, none of us ever do this, but if you blow a driver, you can literally just take it down, put it on there, replace the driver, put it back, and all your Dolby preset parameters are there, and you're still Dolby Well, it was certified, but now at least if you've followed all the directions, you've worked with Dolby, your room is listed by Dolby, and that's where you're going to start getting work. So being precise and accurate is what Triad Orbit's always been about, and it's the simplest things that are the most critical things. And as Josh said, in a complicated situation, this is probably the best and only way to go, unless, again, you have labor and guys with wrenches and, don't mind working really hard. We want to make it simple and easy and accurate. If you don't know how Triad Orbit works, basically everything we've done has been about speed and accuracy. This is called I/O. It snaps right in. Gil from Avid uses all of Triad Orbit to shoot all his videos for the S6 and S4 consoles. He's got clamps, he's got wall mounts, he's got stands. He asked me to make this specifically for Avid. This block on the backside of an S6 console, every frame has this block to mount to. So this can mount on every frame, and you can now have a mic, a light, a camera, a speaker, a television monitor, pop in and out anywhere you want. And then if you're not using it, you can literally then just go pop it into a wall or back to your mic stands. So this is called I/O, and this is called iOS 6, and it's how everything Triad Orbit works. Everything attaches to everything else. You can build basically anything you want. So I'm going to pass these around. The spring pin works. You pull it halfway out, and then you can move to your spot, and then you put it halfway again, find your spot, and it's locked. And I'll go the other way with this. Just push it in and pull that sleeve to pop it out. Now you can feel I/O. Again, Triad Orbit, there's a stand back there. You can really feel the structure and the foundation of what we do and how we got to the point we can make speaker mounts like this. I ask you to play with that. And again, thanks for your time.
So yeah, we're going to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of hardware and software, and definitely really kind of continue the conversation. A lot of things have been discussed, and there's a lot of bits kind of floating in the air, like how do I actually, coalesce all of that into a real solution? And so I think we make a lot of the really critical parts of that conversation. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. Obviously, central to everything, as you've probably understood, is the renderer, right? That's critical. And there's some different flavors of that, which we'll talk about. But yeah, you certainly need to have a way to monitor not only the binaural, right? So a high quality headphone amp, but ultimately the majority of your work is going to be done with loudspeakers. And so you need to have a quality converter. And one of those solutions is Matrix Studio, which we'll talk about. There's some other pieces in here too that are, I think, very important. And one of those is some kind of a control surface. Whether that's S4, S6 at the high end, I mean, that's fantastic. Or even something like Avid Control, which is actually free for iOS or Android. It's basically a control surface based on iOS. It's a tablet-based surface. But that's really about taking an element, moving it spatially, XYZ, and then also being able to control your monitoring environment, right? Talk about, oh, well, now I got 12 speakers. Maybe I want to, listen to just the ceiling. Maybe I want to dim, I want to cut, I want to attenuate, I want to do any possible thing, and you can do all of that from Avid Control, as well as from certainly S4, S6. So, a lot of different things to consider. So we're going to kind of get into it a bit. And talk about the pieces. So Pro Tools software certainly is a very important part of the conversation. And it could be Pro Tools Studio, it could be Pro Tools Ultimate, which we'll talk about a bit. Control surfaces, kind of started to discuss that. And we have just unbelievable integration into S4, S6, which we'll show you here when you guys come back for some listening. And then I/O, right? So not just a converter, not just a way to feed your 714 or larger speaker configuration, but how are you routing in a larger Atmos scenario? How are you sending to a dedicated renderer, things like that, Maddie and Dante, and Core Audio, which we'll discuss. Okay, so there's not one solution. That's a really important thing to understand. You will see lots of different solutions. And I think Josh said it best. It's a great thing to start with the Dolby Atmos production suite with headphones and just start to orient yourself with the environment that is the Dolby Atmos production suite, the software renderer interface, and just start to understand the idea of beds and objects and actually taking a sound source and placing it and moving it and understanding what it's going to do. And then you can do a lot of that from the binaural, which we'll talk about. Okay? So we're going to start with some use cases, and then we're going to kind of shift a little bit. And we're on the cusp of releasing a new version of Pro Tools, which is like literally probably hours away, I would imagine. So this conversation is going to change as that is released because there's some new stuff in there that will actually affect the way that you route and the workflow, which is very cool. So this is pre Pro Tools 2022.9, but it's a great place to start. So the conversation is, I've got a laptop, I have Dolby Atmos Production Suite, which understand that that's a Mac only option. So if you're going to run that, oh, and then the little one at the upper right hand corner, that means single system. That means I'm running the renderer and my DAW, Pro Tools, everything on the same computer, whether it's a laptop, a Mac Studio, iMac, whatever. It's the same computer, okay? And when you see two, that's two rigs. And as you get into bigger workflows, we'll discuss the benefits of actually having a dedicated computer that does nothing except act as the renderer. There's definitely benefits there. So, single system, pretty much as simple as it could be, meaning it's running Pro Tools, it's running, and that could be either Pro Tools Studio or Pro Tools Ultimate, full Atmos capability, and it's running Dolby Atmos Production Suite. And we're essentially sending all of the outputs of Pro Tools via Core Audio. If you look at this, it says we're using Core Audio as the audio driver. We're sending into the renderer with something called Dolby Audio Bridge, which is what Dolby installs. When you install that, just think of it as a 130-channel bus. And it's literally, that's all your objects and beds. It goes up to 128 channels. And then there's a couple channels for LTC. And that's, basically about making sure that the metadata is sent at the right time. That's what that is, okay? So Core Audio via Dolby Audio Bridge, getting us into the renderer, and then that goes out to, that could be assigned to just built-in output, built-in headphones. And that's it. And you're listening through the binaural then at that time, okay? So that's the start. And is this practical? Is it feasible? Absolutely. You should start here and start playing with it because it's actually really compelling. And even more so when we start, we'll actually mention, Mark mentioned the beta, right, of the actually doing a custom scan of your head, which will increase the accuracy of the binaural, right? We'll mention that as well. So pivot to a couple hours from now or whatever, from when we release Pro Tools 22.9, there's a new thing in here which is really cool that is called aux.io. In concept, if you think about what Dolby Audio Bridge is, it's a Core Audio bus, right? Very useful. aux.io basically, right in the I/O setup of Pro Tools, gives you the ability to patch in or out any virtual, Dolby Audio Bridge is a virtual, or physical Core Audio device in or out of Pro Tools, regardless of the playback engine. So if you think about that, could be an audio interface, could it be a USB microphone, could be audio movers, could be loop back, could be any of that stuff, and you're going to just see it, all the channels, whatever width it is, and you just say, oh, I want these as inputs, I want these as outputs, and you can do that while you maintain your existing engine. Let's say your engine's HDX. I'm going to bring in some stuff from Logic or Ableton at the same time, and I want to output to Zoom at the same time. You can do that now, all in the I/O setup. So that's aux.io, and I'm setting that up because it changes the conversation about the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, right? Up until now, we've been having Dolby Audio Bridge as the playback engine in Pro Tools. It's fine, but it's not as performant as something like HDX, for example, and it limits what you can do in terms of inputs and all kinds of things. It really it paints you into a corner a little bit in terms of the playback engine, right? So now having this, it means you can have any playback engine you want and still pipe anything digitally, right? Which I think is really powerful. obviously with the pandemic, the obvious thing is, need to go to Audio Movers, need to go to Zoom, right? Or Google Meets or whatever you're doing. Super simple. No plugins, whatever channel, however wide of channels you want that bus to be, fine, you can do that. For guys doing post, critical, obviously SoundMiner, bass head, audio finder, sample libraries, you're auditioning, right? You don't want to really use Rewire, so that's a great thing. Music workflows, right? Having pipes from Ableton, from Logic, from MainStage, from dedicated VIs like Moog, desktop VIs, things like that, or standalone versions of Keyscape, whatever, right? Just pipe it in to Pro Tools. And then, so this is where we're kind of leading up to, right, is discussing the renderer. And then harebrained, creative processing, which I like to do, which we'll discuss a little bit, okay? So this is the 101. When you install Pro Tools 22.9, just like you saw your Audio MIDI setup audio, you see it get extra virtual nodes or virtual devices, right? You see Dolby Audio Bridge. Just like when you install Audio Movers, you see Omnibus, and you see those virtual paths. We now will install a whole bunch of flavors of stereo and 5.1 and 16 channel and 32 channel and 64 channel things called Pro Tools Audio Bridge. I guess we stole the name from Dolby, but I don't think they're going to litigate. I think we're okay. If you want to actually go in here, you can just tweak a little text file, and you can actually customize this, right? So I made, because I'm a little OCD, I made a to and from Zoom, and they're stereo, right? So you literally can have, and on Pro Tools Ultimate, unlimited inputs, unlimited outputs. Do whatever you want to do, okay? And then super simple, to from Zoom, right? Could not be simpler.
Is this a Mac only feature, I assume?
It is. It is Mac only because the whole construct is core audio. Yeah. So until there's that kind of a rich environment on the Windows, we'd love to do it. It doesn't exist. Right. The layers don't exist for us to do that. So it's Mac. That's right. For creatively, and this is, I'll just kind of plant some seeds because I'm kind of nuts about just manipulating things and glitching and half speeding and reversing. And so just think about anything can go in or out now, including an Atmos space, right? So we were doing some things earlier where I was taking binaural recordings that I recorded from the subway in New York and actually funneling them in and actually then panning them as stereo objects and just doing just weird stuff. But think about, I can re-record anything I'm doing in Pro Tools, whether it's like half speed or scrubbing through an Eventide plugin and then outputting that into Max and then re-recording that, just, right? So creatively, it opens up the doors to do anything, which I think is fantastic, right? One really, really big point about this, right? And because people are like, well, I've done aggregate and I've glued that and I've had this bus and I've added Dante Virtual Sound Card to HDX and I've had Omnibus and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you can do that. The problem with that is it's really not locked together in a very good way, right? So under the hood, both the Dolby Audio Bridge and the Pro Tools Audio Bridge are totally locked, synchronized, clocked to your main audio engine, to your playback engine. So for HDX, it will never drift, right? And that is really a big deal. So this is the other cool part about the Pro Tools Audio Bridge is that it's locked, right? So that was all a setup to get us to here. And so now we're back at binaural. We're back in the laptop with the same thing, Dolby Atmos Production Suite, Pro Tools Studio, Pro Tools Ultimate, whichever you want to go with. But now we can basically say, you know what? I'm still getting there with Dolby. Still going from Pro Tools into the renderer with Bridge, but I'm coming now out of the renderer with Pro Tools Audio Bridge. And I'm going into Pro Tools, and I'm going to say, basically, I want a stereo 2.0. I want a binaural headphones. I want to be able to see loudness measurement with, Isotope or Nugent or whatever I like to use in real time as I'm mixing, right? So I can look at that 5.1 loudness re-render, and I can get whatever I need to listen to. If it's just laptop, it's binaural. And my playback engine can be whatever I want it to be, independent, right? So I'm still going to the renderer with Dolby Audio Bridge, but I'm not locked into that as a playback engine, and I'm returning with Pro Tools Audio Bridge. just gives me tons of flexibility. And that's with aux.io. Okay, so that's kind of what we're leading up to here. I'll mention this because Mark mentioned it, and it is really cool, and I've done it. I've created a preset for my own giant head, and you can just throw that into a folder on the renderer, and it gives you a closer approximation of for your particular the shape of your head, and it's just an app you can download. It's in beta, and it tells you how to position it and how to move it around your head, and then it gives you a file that you can load into the renderer. So it's worth checking out. I would absolutely encourage you to do that. So now, if you've kind of gone from the 101, which is the laptop and headphones that you really like, that you're familiar with, now you're talking about actually getting into loudspeakers, and that is really where you're going to do hopefully most of your work. Which is what in Dolby considers 714 to really be the start, right? Some of the big music guys will talk about the wides, as being a really cool thing. So you can certainly grow into a 914 or a 916, but really, if you're going to do this and you're serious about this, a 714 is where you start, right? Same as Josh said, same type of speaker, right? Placed correctly, and then having a good converter, right? With a monitor section that can attenuate the 714, that can do all of that stuff. So this is like a HDX TB3 bundle with Matrix Studio. Matrix Studio has all kinds of goodness in it for connecting to your HDX engine, for being able to do up to a 916 tuned, right, with up to 16 filters per speaker, delays, trims, all of that, right? Bass management, high quality headphone amps. You can do your binaural, you can do your stereo, you can feed talent, you can do any of that. And it's super low pro, right? It's a 1U box, okay? So now we've pivoted into basically the environment where this is the key, right? The key is I'm not living in Dolby Audio Bridge as the engine. I can now leverage the performance and the clocking and the resolve and the input and all the goodness and the DSP that is HDX in this case, right? But I can still use Dolby Audio Bridge, right? So that's a really cool thing about aux.io. It kind of frees you from having to use Bridge as everything, right? Your whole world. So this is, again, we're kind of heading forward, okay? We're going to pivot again because this is something you need to understand, that there's different binaurals, right? There's different headphone experiences that you need to be aware of. But thankfully, now that you have, or soon that you have aux.io, you can create a simple, like a super simple Logic session to be able to listen through in real time, right? So again, one of the conversations, and everybody's kind of mentioned it so far, is I'm going to do most of my mixing on speakers, but compatibility with this is huge because they said most people are listening on headphones. So you want to listen to the Dolby binaural. You probably want to listen to the Apple Spatial because that's what people are listening on their AirPods from Apple Music. You probably want to listen to a soundbar. Listen as many places as possible. So what we've done here is just leveraging Pro Tools Audio Bridge. We've basically just sent out of the renderer, okay? These are re-renders, and I think they talked about re-renders a little bit, but that's a beautiful thing where the master engine renderer that's doing all the computations for the beds and objects and essentially doing all the heavy lifting for your spatial audio, it can simultaneously spit out all kinds of different recomputed formats, right? A 2.0, a stereo, a binaural, which is a Dolby binaural, a 7.1, or a 714. So we're sending a 714 out of here, and we're just piping it with Pro Tools Audio Bridge. And it's going through in kind of input mode through Logic, just to be able to use that, just to be able to say, oh, what does this sound like on my AirPods, right? With or without head tracking. And so you can QC in real time as you're working, right? And again, you can leverage that with aux.io soon, right? Which is super cool, super powerful.
Does the production suite do re-renders live though, or you have to make the ADM first and then?
Production Suite does a bunch of re-renders live. Yeah, so we can do a 2.0, we can do a binaural, we can do a 714, we can do a 5.1 loudness, we can do Yada, yada, yada. Lots. Yes, you don't need mastering suite to do live re-renders. Yeah, good question. So more conversations, right? So now we're into two. We're into two systems. You're like, well, why would I do two systems? Well, when you start getting into larger requirements, huge mixes that are pretty intense, using all possible objects and beds, and lots of layers, lots of automation, lots of plugins, your computer, depending on what computer you have, might not be able to do it all, right? And that's why people will put together, I'm going to put together a Mac Mini, either Intel or Silicon, and that thing's going to be the renderer, right? And so now I need to feed this, and that's with a qualified Dolby I/O solution, and that's either going to be Matty or Dante, right? If you look at all the different possible scenarios, and just like Avid, Dolby has a whole deep website of this is what we've tested, this is what you're going to do, right? And we'll go through a couple of different boxes, but it's either Dante or Matty. And the maximum, the total channel count is 128 channels in and out, okay? So that's pretty straightforward. So we're expanding into Silicon stuff, which is great. HDX, Matrix. Matrix just goes way further than Matrix Studio with expandability and DigiLink and massive Dante configurations. Just gives you a lot more flexibility. We're still using an HDX engine. Depending on how many digital and analog things we need to lock together in the studio, you might want to also add SyncX. It just depends on how many things you're actually trying to clock, right? And if it gets to be hairy, it's a good idea to feed everybody Word and HD video ref and spit out LTC and do all that, do that kind of thing. But that's really based on your use case that you might need that. Okay? So let's pivot in a different direction. So let's talk a little bit about Pro Tools. And all of this stuff that we're going to see here, this actually applies to both Pro Tools Studio and Pro Tools Ultimate. Okay? All of the implementation, all the functionality that is Atmos in Pro Tools is in both versions. So the first thing is in the peripherals dialogues, you can go either on the same machine or on the network, and you can go grab onto the renderer. And you can basically say, hey, here I am. Okay, we're talking. Now we're going to exchange metadata. And we're going to manage, how I drive these beds and objects and things. Okay, so that's important, but pretty simple. And then the big thing is, and Mark mentioned it, whether I'm doing channel-based work or I'm doing object-based work, and there still is a reason why you're going to use the non-object panner. Doesn't matter. Either way, you can control that from the integrated panner in Pro Tools, right? You have that flexibility. You have access to all the goodness that has Atmos. So that's X, that's Y, that's Z, that's size, that's zone masks, that's speaker snap, that's all of that stuff, right, that was previously in the dedicated panner plugin is just built into here if you toggle into object mode. Okay, so it's very, very simple actually to get there. One other thing I'm going to mention here that's actually, if you've never tried or played with, it's really useful. So I've got the renderer. Let's just do single system. I got the renderer. I got Pro Tools. I got my laptop ready to go, right? I turn the renderer on. We're communicating. Everything's good. I can literally go into the I/O setup, and under the bus tab, I can say, use Dolby Atmos. Let's just say in this case, renderer stereo. So make me stereo objects with mono subs. So I can either do mono objects or stereo objects. Either way, I can literally click default, and it will build all of the internal buses, the mapping to outputs, the mapping to objects, the bus assignments, the bed assignments, everything, literally in one button press. It gives you that default 10-channel bed, 118 objects, and it like no work. So for people that are intimidated by the I/O setup window, that's a really cool thing because it literally is like, okay, here we go. Just let me throw a guitar track and start moving it around, and you can do that. So that's a really useful thing to know.
And are you doing that per bus, per channel, or on the master?
So that functionality, that's building the whole environment, right? That's saying, okay, you got one master bed, and then you've got all 118 objects, and you can either address them as a stereo or a mono. I want to take a reverb, the return of a reverb, and use a stereo object and be able to place that, maybe in the back and at a certain height. That's a stereo object. I want to take a shaker or a vocal or a djembe or something. It's mono. and I want to just assign that to a mono object. I can do either or. Now that it's built all of those available resources that I can address. I can assign to a 2.0, a 5.0, a 7.0 as a subset, a subpath of the main bed. Do that. That's just hitting the bed, not as an object, but as a channel, as a bed. Right? I can do any of that after I've kind of created that I/O requirements. That makes sense. The other really powerful thing about this now in Pro Tools, this is this is now called bounce mix. Previous was bounce to disk. Okay, so same thing you're going to look at for stereo or 5.1 or 7.1, but the file type is Dolby Atmos. Right? It's wave. It's B wave. It's an ADM B wave. And that is, I think Mark mentioned it, that is the deliverable requirement, right? If you're going to deliver something to Amazon or Universal or Netflix or whoever, it's going to be an ADM B wave, right? It's a giant wave file that has all the metadata and all the PCM audio in it. And if you take that file and you drag it onto Pro Tools, it'll basically bring up import session data, and it'll say, oh, here's your bed 1, bed 2, object 11, 12, 13, 14, groups, labels, everything. And you hit OK, new tracks. It builds a master Pro Tools session with all the audio and the metadata, the automation, the beds, the objects, everything. And you hit play, and then Rocket Man plays back. Right? It is literally a just add water and you have a master. That's what an ADM is. Okay? So that's really important. But you can deliver that right from here. And you see it says, oh, you got one bed and you got 94 objects. It tells you actually what, before you do it, what you're going to be including. Okay? So that's important. That's that one master file. The other really cool thing about this is, at the same time, you can create all your re-renders. Right? So we talked about re-renders for the 2.0, the binaural, the 7.1.4, and any versions of that. So, okay, I want a stereo binaural. That's very important. I want a stereo with 2.0. Great. Well, what if I just want, and this is a kind of a post example, what if the food groups are dialogue music effects? Or if the food groups are strings, keys, drums, right? It doesn't matter what the food groups are. But in this case, it's post. So just give me the music stuff, but I want a 7.1 or a 5.1 of that so I can hear that and see what is that going to do. Okay, so check this out. You can literally make these little presets where you can take any combination of a stereo, a binaural, a 5.1, a 7.1, of any of the components of the food groups and export it all at the same time in an automated fashion. There's all the resulting files, either interleaved or mono in subfolders. Okay, so you're making your master deliverable. You're making all the possible deliverables at the same time right from Pro Tools. And you can save it as a preset. So if you're doing this again and again, you just load the preset and it populates all the fields and you hit go and you go get coffee.
How do you denote, like, what if you've got objects that are music and a bed track for music? How does it know to lump all those together into one 7.1 file?
Yeah, so actually, if you look at it's probably kind of small, but there's include, first of all, it's like, do you want full mix? That's every bed and every object, or do you want custom? And then you're getting into the granularity. And then it says, of the food groups, do you want beds or objects for each thing, right? So you could say, yeah, you could absolutely do, just give me a 5.1 of music objects. It'll do that. You could do a 5.1 of all things music.
How do you assign it to the music label, I guess is the question I'm asking.
Oh, got it. Yeah, good question. So that's a really cool thing that we added not so long ago in Pro Tools.
Is that done on the I/O setup?
Yeah, so one of the really cool things we added to Pro Tools is previous, older versions, legacy versions, you had to actually kind of pre-think about, oh, I'm going to have a strings bed. I'm going to have a drums bed. I'm going to have a keys bed. The cool thing is now you can just take a vanilla Atmos I/O setup, which is back to the one bed, 10 channels, 118 objects, right? Simple, right? And compatible between, I move a session around between all these rooms, and it's just, I don't have to keep changing my input configuration. So you got that, right? But the smart thing with the bounce mix intelligence now is, and it's probably hard to see, but internal buses, dialogue effects, music, that's an internal bed, right? Just an internal bus. They're all mapped to the same channels 1 through 10. But Pro Tools is smart enough to allow you to create deliverables based on all those internal buses. Yeah, so you have, 10 different food groups, but they're all pointing to the first bed. You can still make all those deliverables. So that is a really, really cool thing, because you don't have to worry about, because when you start a session with Atmos, you have to think about, how am I going to use my beds and objects? And previously it would be like, well, this is a food show, and so we're going to have dialogue, music, effects, narration, right? But then I go into, this is a film, this is theatrical. We're going to have a main bed and then maybe a lot of objects. So you have to think about how you're going to use all those resources. Anyway, that's now a lot easier, actually, because you can do it all in here.
And that creates bus tracks that actually route audio, so you can process the bed if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can process any of the beds. Yep. So just to kind of reiterate, the aux I/O allows you to stay in the same engine, allows you to stay in HDX, for example, and still pipe anything from Core Audio in and out of Pro Tools, which is huge. So in this workflow, we're getting to the renderer on the same system. On the same system, it's going to be Core Audio. We're getting to the renderer with Dolby Audio Bridge. We're getting back to Pro Tools with Pro Tools Audio Bridge. Okay, so that's what that's doing. I wanted to dig in a little bit closer into this because it's important. This is that Mark mentioned, the Dolby Atmos binaural settings plugin, the DAB-SP.
We love our acronyms in Dolby, but that one I would not give an acronym.
So you take the DAB-SP. No, I'm just kidding. So this is actually cool. It actually does a couple things. So one of the things we talked about is if you are using multiple physical beds, it'll actually it'll communicate to the renderer when you open the Pro Tools session and say, oh, you know what? I'm doing 3 beds and I got these objects and they're labeled as such. It does all that for you. So you don't have to go, I'm going to go change my input configuration file in the renderer every time. That's cool. Less of a need now, but what this is really critical for is the binaural, right? So as you start to work, again, you need to really listen to on headphones and see how it works. And for every object, you can basically place, if you think about the binaural being like a virtual room and you're listening into it, there's a sound source, right? There's a shaker or there's a background vocal or there's whatever. And it's either close to you or it's further and further away or it's not managed. And so you can do near, mid, far, and off for every object, 118 in the whole thing. And you can manage that with this plugin and it recalls everything. It's very, very useful.
To be clear, off it's not binauralized, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I think a lot of people will put, what's a good use case for that? Just, certain elements that you don't want to be kind of put into that virtual room.
Like a vocal.
Yeah, you could, So that's an important thing. It gets installed automatically. You don't have to worry about it, but you should use it because it's really important and useful. Okay, so now we're going to pull back and we're going to talk about kind of the components. Again, you could start with Pro Tools Studio. Pro Tools Ultimate absolutely can do a full complement of Atmos. I/O, you need to have a high quality converter, as Josh said, to be able to output to speakers, to be able to attenuate, have a monitor section. That's critical. Matrix will do that. Matrix Studio will do that. You also should think about having something that can do, trims, delays, filters, bass management, right? It's a really good idea. And we have that capability in our Matrix family products. Now, the other thing to consider, and I kind of mentioned it, is a control surface is super valuable. Because, and we were looking at this yesterday a little bit, we're like, can you show me the breakpoint automation for the pan for that one object? I'm like, yeah, it's this big, right? Because it's 15 lanes. Like, yeah, we're going to draw that all in with a pencil tool. I'm like, no, you're not going to do that. So even having something like Avid Control, which is a free control surface, right, runs on your iPad, is super useful because you can do multi-passes of pan moves and, group some elements and move them, listen to it, right? So that's this is the gateway drug into this. And that is all Yukon-powered surfaces, okay? And you'll come and take a look at S4. But the whole environment is all about getting better tactile control. That's really what this is all about. So I would encourage you to check out Avid Control if you have not already. So this goes down the rabbit hole a little bit further. I'm not going to obsess about this, but basically to understand that when you start to get larger requirements or needs, you can start to build larger systems. You start stacking matrix studios, you start expanding matrices, you start, adding more I/O, and you've got a dedicated renderer. It's just a scalable system. Okay, that's really the point of this conversation. And the I/O is all about Dolby qualifying a box, right? Again, if you're on an Intel, that Focusrite PCIe card, that works really well. RME has boxes that are Dante and Matti. There's a lot of options that you could use for the I/O, for the dedicated renderer. We're in a two-system conversation now, and we're offloading all the host and bandwidth requirements that are required to a separate computer, right? Which has benefits. Okay, and then ultimately you get into this giant, mostly again all this stuff started for theatrical. The whole conversation of Atmos, as Mark mentioned with Brave, started in the cinema. And so this is what people do when you're talking about a big television or big film workflow. You've got something like a matrix which is connecting 4 or 5 workstations with sources and recorders, all clocked, all resolved, all talking to a dedicated renderer, which is either Matti or Dante. And that's how big it can scale if you need it to. Okay, and then hopefully everything is clocked, right? Everything is resolved and perfectly clocked and fed, and so you have no drift over any period of time. And again, if it gets into a larger scenario, SyncX is a great solution, which now actually works standalone also, as a standalone word clock distribution amp, as a standalone HD generator, ref generator, standalone LTC. It'll do all that now. So that's just something to understand. Okay, we're almost there. There's a lot of plugins, right? There's too many plugins. I will mention one thing about this, and Mark kind of started the conversation. It's super cool. Yeah, if you're in a DAW that doesn't have integrated panning, you need it. But even if you're using Pro Tools and you're doing music, this thing is super cool. Because just think about like your favorite tempo sync delay, but tempo sync pan. And that's what it is. I've got some sessions that'll play back that'll melt your head that are very tempo synced and super creative, right? To actually have certain elements that are snapping to musical values, and that you should play with that Dolby Atmos music panner. There's lots of other cool stuff, and we have stuff on our website as did Dolby to check out for EQs and compression and dynamics. I think Waves literally just today launched some new dynamics tools which look really cool. One thing I will mention that is important. If you haven't kind of listened to people talk about Atmos, listen to Andrew Sheps, Steve Genowick, some of the other guys from Capitol talk about Atmos, because they've spent the most time actually understanding how to work in that format. They've done stereo mixes for years, but like, okay, how do I now think in this with this tool? And Steve and some of those guys like Sheps are the guys to listen to, right? Because they've really spent a ton of time thinking about it. And so I would encourage you to go there and do that. Because it's not just about, throw up some speakers and, yeah, it sounds perfect. Well, okay, now what does it sound like for the Dolby binaural? What does it sound like Apple Spatial? What does it sound like on the sound bar, et cetera? There's great reverbs and things that work in immersive, but again, you don't have to use an immersive reverb. You could use your favorite reverb and again, assign that to a stereo object and then put that somewhere in the space, right, to create an environment. And that's a very common technique too. If you do want to explore some immersive verbs, there's amazing stuff from Liquid Sonics and Exponential/Isotope, and even Acon Digital is very good. Check that out. They're excellent. Okay. Lastly, last slide. Actually, no, almost the last. We have an environment for Matrix and Matrix Studio. It's called Dadman. And any of your sources, whether it's, HDX, right, like DigiLink from Pro Tools, 5171 stereo, Dante, like Dante Virtual Soundguard, or a physical Dante, analog, or the output of the renderer or any re-renders, I can listen to whatever I want in a calibrated, tuned environment, and I can choose multiple sets of speakers. What am I listening to? I can audition just, the ceiling, the sides, the rears, any of that stuff, totally tuned, totally calibrated, and it's all customizable in this thing called DADman. And that talks to your matrices, matrix studios. It'll actually talk to, I think, up to 64 at once, which is kind of nuts. So, lastly, once you build that monitor profile in DADman, then either with your Avid control, which is free, or your S4, your S6, MOM, any of these things, actually all these things in concert talk to Yukon. And they're on this kind of big Yukon network, and they can all manage the monitor profile. All right? And the monitor profile is composed of control room, talent A, producer, headphone B, binaurals, like all of this stuff. These are all separate monitors within the big profile file, right? So it's super powerful, super customizable, and any of these can be anything from mono to 64-channel Atmos, right? Okay, so that's Atmos.